Live from the TV30 studio, here is Jim Schneider.
Well, hi, and welcome to inFocus. We're glad that you've joined us for our broadcast here this evening as we talk about issues, public policy issues often here on the program, and address just a number of matters that impact us, impacts our freedoms, impacts our faith, impacts certainly our way of life, our families here, and focusing in primarily southeast Wisconsin tonight. No matter where you are watching this evening, the program will have special significance to you as well. You know, our country, in my opinion, is in a mess. We have seen that there is great disregard for our Constitution today. There's a ruling by executive order that is taking place. We know that laws are being ignored constantly across this land. The separation of powers has been breached. Bureaucrats are taking more and more control over every aspect of our lives. We saw how it was with COVID, where you can shop, if you can shop, where, what hours you can shop, what you can buy, what is essential, what is non-essential. We see raids taking place in our current society today on certain citizens, sometimes depending upon viewpoints and the ideals that a person has. The question is, how did we ever get to this point? How did we ever get to this point where we are as a nation? And is there a course back? Is there a way that we can get back to how our founders intended for us to be as a nation? Or are we just beyond hope at this point? Are we beyond being able to go back? We're going to be addressing a number of issues this evening. It's our privilege to have in studio with us tonight William J. Federer. Bill is a nationally known speaker, historian, author, president of Amerisearch Incorporated. He's a speaker in the American Minute daily broadcast. He has authored numerous books. I've got a few of them with me here this evening. Here is America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations. Just a wealth of information here. Quotes from founding fathers, statesmen, state constitutions, lots of information in that encyclopedia. Also, who is the king in America and who are the counselors to the king? A very important book for a day like today in which we live. And another book that Bill wrote, just a powerful book entitled Socialism. This is the real history from Plato to the present. And you'll find a subtitle here, How the Deep State capitalizes on crises to consolidate control. These books are all available at the VCY bookstore at 107th and Capitol Drive, and powerful books. But Bill, we'd like to welcome you here to the program inFocus.
Well, Jim, great to be with you.
Bill, I described at the beginning of this program tonight the mess that we're in as a nation right now, but it's not always been this way, and so we want our viewers tonight to understand what was the intent of the founders for our nation, what and where did we get off course as a nation, and can we get back on course again? But let's take a look at what our founders, first of all, intended for this nation to be, because we've so strayed from what they wanted.
Well, those are great questions, Jim. And one of the things I've done in the book, Who is the King in America, is I wanted to see the big picture. Mm-hmm. So I literally spent a couple years researching every civilization that has ever existed on planet Earth, all the way back to Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley, and thousands of years of Egyptian pharaohs and kings of Assyria and kings of Persia and Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan. It's kings. The most common form of government in all of world history is kings. Power wants to concentrate into the hands of one person, like a black hole, right? It's the gravity that bends light, it sucks it in. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one takes the rattle from the others. You put some kids on a playground, one's the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one of them is the diva. You put some people in the woods, one of them is an Indian chief. You put them in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. So the default setting for human government is selfishness and power concentrating into the hands of one person. As the centuries go on, with military advancements, kings can kill more people. Mm. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they're killing with bronze weapons or iron weapons or big, long phalanx spears that the Greeks had or scimitar swords that the Muslims had. The weapon improves, but it's that same fallen nature. And then with technological advancements, kings can track more people. I mean, Augustus Caesar wanted to have a worldwide tracking system. It was called the census. That was like new technology back then. If they could have had 5G and cell phones and cameras, they would have tracked people that way. And as the centuries go on, these kingdoms get bigger till finally the King of England had the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. 13 million square miles, 500 million people. He had India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, and America. So the King of England was a one world government globalist, and America's founders decided they didn't like one world government globalists telling us what to do, so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. So kings have subjects who are subjected to the king's will. Democracies and republics have citizens. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-king. And so we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. We're basically pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves. So when somebody protests the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest this system where I participate in ruling myself. It's like, okay, somebody else will tell you what to do with your life. And so America's founders broke away from a king. They flipped it. Instead of power flowing top down from a king, the power is flowing bottom up from we the people. Where did the founders of America get these ideas? From the New England pastors. Where did they get their ideas? The Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. It's called the Hebrew Republic. And this was studied so much during the 15 and early 1600s that the scholars in Europe were called Christian Hebraists. I mean, these Puritan scholars were experts on the Jerusalem Talmud and Maimonides, who was a Jewish rabbi, and the Tanakh and all this. And they were fascinated at this era of history around 1400 BC to around 1000 BC, where Israel had 400 years with no king. And it worked because every citizen was taught the law, and every citizen was personally accountable to God to follow the law. And so that's what America's New England pastors looked to as the perfect model.
Very interesting. And it came to a point, though, where those people said, we also want a king.
Yeah. And so in ancient Israel, the priests stopped teaching the law. You think they did? Yeah, there's the story of Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. He's not even teaching the law to his own sons. And then there's a story of a Levite with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. The tribe of Dan comes along and steals the graven image and tells this Levite, come along with us, you can be a priest to our whole tribe. And you're reading the story in the book of Judges, and you're like, what's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't it one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them, but yet he's got one. He's not following the law. And then you have the terrible story of a Levite with a concubine. And the law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with the woman he's not even married to. They're traveling, and they're in a house surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the last stages of a people ruling themselves is casting off of self-restraint, abandonment to passion. They rape the poor girl to death. And by the time you're grossed out with the story, you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priest stopped teaching them what was right in the Lord's eyes. And so you take the power of a king, you separate it into the hands of the people, it's chaos, unless all the people are taught the law. But what motivates them to follow the law is there's a God who's watching everyone. He wants you to be fair. He's going to hold you accountable in the future. But if you get rid of this God, all you got is a bunch of laws that some old white men made up. Why follow them? Some will, as long as it's the ends thing socially. Others are going to say, forget this, and they're going to yield to their selfish human nature and start robbing and killing and smashing windows and setting things on fire. And then everybody's going to panic and fear and say, we want someone to come along and fix this mess. And that's when the rubber band snaps back. And in Israel's case, that's when they got a King Saul.
Wow.
You know, they after this poor girl's raped to death, and they have all these tribe of Benjamins getting wiped out, and it's just this chaos at the end of the book of Judges. And they all go to Samuel and they say, this self-government system's not working anymore. We want someone to come along and fix this mess. We want a king.
Yeah. Certainly remember at that account there, Bill, that God reminded Samuel that they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. This is what he had set up for them.
And so it's interesting, the kings of England looked to the King Saul and on period as the part of the Bible they wanted to quote from, the anointed king. The Puritans and the Pilgrims looked to the pre-King Saul period, where they was a nation with millions of people, and for 400 years they didn't have a king because everybody was taught the law, and everybody was personally accountable to God to follow the law. So America's founders were breaking away from the King of England, and they said, for this thing to work, the population needs to be taught the law, and they need to be aware that they're accountable to God, who's watching them, wants them to be fair, you're going to hold them accountable. So when we say it's one nation under God, it's more than just a nice little acknowledgement. It's the constant awareness that God is watching me, he wants me to be fair, he's going to hold me accountable in the future, that motivates everybody to having self-control, to treating their neighbor nice, right? And so our form of government in America was intended to, the King of England was the most powerful king on planet Earth. And our founders were preoccupied with wanting to prevent power from reconcentrating. So they took that Tower of Babel, so to speak, and they scattered. They took the power of a king and they broke it into federal to state level. And then they broke it into 3 branches and pitted them against each other, sort of a 3-way tug of war. And then they took 10 handcuffs, the first 10 amendments, to handcuff this Frankenstein down before they threw the switch and breathed life into it, right? The whole purpose of the Constitution was to prevent a president from ruling through mandates and executive orders. Should I say that again?
Yeah, because we hear that, and that's exactly where we are today. That is taking place. But this was not the intent of the founders. That's not how they framed our Constitution. And it even echoes what they said in the Declaration of Independence. King, we're not going that direction. We're rejecting that rule that you have over us. We're going to be an independent, sovereign nation here. And something happened to get us off course.
Yeah, and I think it started with the churches stopped teaching that they thought it was holier not to be involved. And that subtle thought began to creep in. And then you had, Unitarians coming around saying, well, we're going to de-emphasize the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And then the Universalists came in and said, well, everybody eventually universal will be saved, so you don't have to bother preaching the gospel anymore. And then in the more or less middle to late 1800s, you had Harvard go from a Puritan-based college to a Unitarian college. And so they had some different presidents that decided...
Polar opposites.
Yeah. And these Unitarian leaders of Harvard wanted to remove all the real Christian symbols and artifacts and, different documents and so forth. And so that was, once Harvard changed, then the other schools began to change, and then it began to infect the main population. One of the interesting turning points is evolution. So when Darwin came up with his theory of evolution in the middle 1800s, somebody named Herbert Spencer wanted to apply evolution to other areas of academia, including law. And so Harvard had a law professor, Christopher Columbus Langdell. His statue's in the basement of the U.S. Capitol. And he invented case precedent theory of law. He wanted, instead of going back to read the Founding Fathers and the debates of the Constitution, you just take the most recent case and have it evolve, evolution. And so his theory, it was the only law school in the country that taught that. But then other schools began to pick it up. And so it got to the place where we forget what the Founding Fathers cared about. We're just having it evolve with a political agenda. And the person that was a graduate of Harvard at this time was Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. And even his biographer wrote, Holmes broke new intellectual trails, and instead of the law being something that came down from God, it's an ever-evolving thing. And so if you're going to have the law, now the founders had a way to make it evolve. It's called the amendment process. You need a supermajority. You need 2/3 of the House and Senate and then 3/4 of the states to ratify it, and then you have amendments. And we can do amendments. We passed the 13th Amendment, ending slavery. 14th Amendment, giving rights to freed slaves. 15th Amendment, making sure that freed slaves could vote. The 19th Amendment, women can vote. We know how to do amendments. We can evolve the Constitution, but it's a supermajority of the people. They didn't want one judge having it evolve in their courtroom by broadening the definition of a word.
And again, that is something that we see happening over and over again. So the founders and the drafters certainly did not ever plan for rule by executive order. They never did plan for just one branch of government to have supremacy over the other branches of government. It was really a systematic, well-designed plan to keep the people in charge rather than rulers, a monarchy, an oligarchy from taking place.
Yeah, so in New England, you had these pastors, and they had congregational form of church government, which is different than the Anglican hierarchical form of church government, where the King of England was the head, and then he had the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, and the curates and deaneries and vicars, and your relationship with God was through this big structure, where the Puritans and the Pilgrims had a congregational church model, where the pastor gets everybody to have their relationship with God through Jesus and then coaches them to become mature Christians and get involved. And everybody's doing something. And so they simply took their community model of government and they made it their government form of government. And so when the Revolutionary War starts, the British send over a military governor, Thomas Gage, and he outlaws these town hall meetings. He says, we don't need the people meeting, just do what the government tells you, top down. And so we see this conflict that America wanted to get away from. But one of the things I bring out in the book on socialism is that if democracies and republics are ways to take the power of the king and give it to the people, what if the king wants the power back? Does he just ask for it? And no, so in times of fear, people will panic and trade freedom for security. And then when they're getting free stuff, and they get free stuff long enough, they get dependent, and then they'll incrementally give up their freedom to keep the free stuff going. It's like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. Comes in with guns, gets everybody in fear, they panic, and they surrender their freedom to the mob. Or the drug dealer's so nice, he's giving away free drugs. And then people get hooked, and then he says, oh, you want some more free drugs? You're going to have to give up your freedom, sell your body into prostitution. And so it's a front door, back door approach of how to get people to give up their freedom and let power reconcentrate into the hands of a king.
Bill, as you're talking and rehearsing on how this nation was founded, the intent of these documents, the people really are king in this regard. This is the way the founders set it up. Can you look back at points of history to show where that deviation took place, where we started surrendering those freedoms and we started turning to what we sought independence from?
Yeah, it's in times of crises. And so, a biblical example, Egypt was having a famine. And Joseph was a godly man, and he concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh. And what does he do with it? He takes care of the children of Israel. But then there's a new Pharaoh that does not know Joseph and uses all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel and make them throw their sons in the Nile River. So that's the dilemma. You have somebody concentrating power because he wants to do something good, but he doesn't live forever, and at some point they get passed over to somebody that uses it for bad. And so let's look at Lincoln. It was good that Lincoln ended slavery. But in the process, he had a lot of rights being taken from the states and concentrated into the hands of the federal government. It was good that Woodrow Wilson wanted to win World War I, but he concentrates power in the federal government with the income tax. And then Franklin Roosevelt wanted to get us through the Great Depression, and he concentrates power with the New Deal programs and outlaws the private ownership of gold and has 3,000 executive orders. It was good that Lyndon Johnson wanted to end poverty, but he concentrates power with his federal government Great Society welfare state. And Nixon wanted to have a war on drugs, and so he concentrates power. And then President Bush wanted to make sure there's no more terrorist attacks, and he concentrates power and creates the NSA and the Patriot Act and all this. And now the government can read everybody's emails, and it's like, wait, I thought this was just supposed to monitor foreign correspondence, but now it's monitoring all of us. How did it get here? Yeah. Right? It was some crisis, and somebody comes along and says, okay, we're going to concentrate power because we're going to do something good. But at some point, it gets handed over to the other party, and they're like, okay, we got more power than we did before. And so that's the dilemma. And we get our guy in, and we say, oh, we'll just turn, and not look if he concentrates power, but it's all going to get passed over to the other party, and then they're going to use it oppressively.
And we're bearing witness today that laws are not being passed by the House and Senate signed by the President. We're seeing a ruling by executive order take place, and that, is there anywhere in the Constitution that gives the President the authority for that executive order process to have the same weight as far as legislation is concerned? Because that's how we view it today.
Yeah, Rome was a republic for 500 years, and they had a emergency position called a dictator, and it was a one-year term that they only used when they were being attacked, and they needed somebody to call the shots. And so during this Roman Republic, they got a guy named Cincinnatus, and he goes into Rome, organizes them, they win the battles, and then after a year, he goes back to his farm. And then when he's 80 years old, they're being invaded again. Everybody gets Cincinnatus. He comes in. He is the one-year dictator. He organizes it. They win the battles. He goes back to his farm. And our founding fathers looked at that as the example. That's why they came up with the Order of Cincinnatus, and Cincinnati, Ohio is named after that order. And so the idea is that it's a limited Washington said the sword is the last thing to pick up and the first thing to put down. But Julius Caesar wanted to be dictator for life. So instead of it being a temporary thing, he just wanted to make it permanent, which was a changing of the form of government from a Roman republic to a Roman empire with an emperor on top. And so there's many presidents that says in times of crises, that's when you need to be the most watchful not to give up your power. Because that's when Harry S. Truman called it a man on horseback. Like a Napoleon will come in and he'll promise to restore order, but he'll end up putting the crown on his own head,
So did we not see the Rahm Emanuel statement about never let a crisis go to waste? We have seen that happen in our history, and we have seen that with the whole matter of the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act and COVID orders, et cetera, where we see that, again, I guess we have that fear that's built in people, and that when this event triggers, then these powers will kick in, and we're witnesses to that.
One of the chapters in my book on socialism is I go through how do you create an atmosphere of fear in order to get people to panic and give up their freedoms. And so you have to create discord. You have to create insecurity. And so how do you create insecurity? The name devil in Hebrew, or Greek rather, can be interpreted to divide. And so here's the devil in heaven, and he divides, and he gets a third of the angels to follow him, and he's cast out. And then he goes into the garden, and he divides, and he gets Adam to blame Eve. And then he gets Cain to kill Abel. And then you go to the republic period of Israel before King Saul, and there was Gideon, and he defeats 100,000 Midianites. And then there's a peace. But Gideon has an illegitimate son named Abimelech, who wants power, so he goes to the town of Shechem and he does identity race politics, critical race theory. And he says, is it better for you that the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your flesh and your bone. And it says, the men of Gideon said, men of Shechem said, we have to support Abimelech because he is our brother. And what does he do? They go to the city treasury and they take money to hire rioters, BLM, Antifa type people. He says, and they took 70 pieces of silver from the house of Baal-berith, wherewith they hired vain and worthless persons, which followed him, to do what? Commit violence, to kill all the half-brothers, the other sons of Gideon. And then the men of Shechem made Abimelech king. So here you have a country completely at peace. Somebody wants power, goes in and sows division, gets discord, and says, okay, my race against the other, my town against your town, and then seizes power. And so the British Empire became the biggest empire in the world. How did they do it? Did they just walk into a country and say, hi, I want to be the biggest empire? Let's look at India. So in 1714, the British land in Bengal and open a trading post that turns into a trading fort that turned into them having guns, and they would give guns to one kingdom, guns to another kingdom, and then stir up division and get them to fight each other. And when they bloodied each other up and weakened each other, the British would conquer both. And they did this again and again and again until they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. They tried doing it in America during the Revolution, going to the Mohawk Indians in New York and trying to stir them up against the Americans. And so this idea is, how do you destroy a marriage? Sow discord. How do you destroy a family? Sow discord. How do you destroy a church? Sow discord. How do you destroy a country? Sow discord. And so Jesus says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. So it's getting it to divide against itself. It's like introducing an autoimmune disease into the body politic. So what's an autoimmune disease? It's where your own immune system starts attacking your own organs. Yeah. And so you want to observe a country, find all the groups, and get the groups to fight each other. And then when they bloody each other up, and that weakens the country, and then they can seize power.
Well, isn't that what the proverb says as well? You know, these 6 things doth the Lord hate. 7 are abomination unto him. We have a proud look. We have a lying tongue. We have hands that shed innocent blood. But in that list, he that soweth discord among the brethren.
Yeah. And so that's Saul Alinsky said that a community organizer's job is to create the issues or the problems. Mm-hmm. The first step in community organization is community disorganization. Rub raw the resentments of the people of a community. Fan the flames of hostility to the point of overt expression. For unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. And Saul Alinsky has an acknowledgement in the front of his book to Lucifer.
My.
This sowing of division. So how do you destroy a great country like America, get everybody to identify with subgroups and pit the subgroups against each other? You know, they did that, the Belgian and German colonizers of the Congo and Rwanda. The people saw themselves as one, but they went in there and measured them and their features, and they said, you're a Hutu and you're a Tutsi. They created artificial racial distinctions that had not been there before. And then they pitted them against each other until they genocided each other. And then the colonizer would say, oh, we're going to restore order, and they would take control of the whole thing.
Wow.
Right? And so it's a strategy that was perfected during the Cold War.
And friends, we're witnessing these very things, pitting together people of different skin color one against another, or social economic stature one against another. We are seeing that take place. William J. Federer, our guest here tonight on inFocus, and certainly talking about this, really the battle for our nation. We see how we were founded as a nation, and some of the things that have been happening in history past and history present, you know, as it's unfolding, to take us off from course. And we're also going to be taking a look at what can we do to get back on track here once again. We'd like to make a special announcement, though, that Bill is in town here tonight. He's going to be coming back next week, and that he is going to be speaking at a special pastors forum at VCY, a Pastors Appreciation Luncheon. And if you're a pastor, if you can get word to your pastor to be in attendance at this next Wednesday, October 19th, 10 o'clock in the morning, it will be right at our VCY headquarters at 35th and Kilbourne. Pastors do need to pre-register. It is free of charge, but they do need to pre-register by calling 414-935-3000. And that deadline is this Friday, October 14th, 414-935-3000. And these books that Bill is talking about here tonight, this on socialism and also Who is the King in America, and other resources are going to be given free of charge to the pastors that are in attendance at this special luncheon. With it being a special time that we honor pastors, we'd like to invite you to be out for this event coming up next Wednesday, but this Friday, the 14th, is the day that you must make your reservations for to attend this luncheon. And we're just going to scratch the surface on these issues here. There's so much that you have in these books. And Bill, we have seen briefly what the founders intended, what the drafters of our Constitution intended. We see also some of the points in time that have gotten us off course. Is there a return that's available to us? Can we right the ship? We see how far amok we are right now. We are ruling by executive order right now. We see more and more power and control that's being assumed by the few. Is there a course back? Is there a way back for us?
There is, and it's local, local, local. So in other words, instead of focusing on all the national races, just focus on your local school board races. Just focus on the doable things. And I'm convinced, you know, if we get through this crisis, there'll be another one. We get through that crisis, there'll be another one. Mm-hmm. You look at history, there's always been crises. Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, bubonic plague, right? I think in a sense that we want to turn the situation around, but the good Lord is letting there be crises sort of to give us a chance to show whose side we're on. Some people's response to a crisis is, well, it's all going to get really bad, and so this just means the end times are coming, so I'm just going to sit back and wait. And your response is revealing the condition of your heart. If you can see that, you know, in California, they just signed a bill to kill a baby that's 28 days old. If you can see that and not be motivated to do something, what does that say about the condition of your heart? Right? If you see the tragedies of these children that are being mutilated and so forth, and you can, Jesus himself said in the beginning, God made a male and female. And yet you know that they're teaching something other than what Jesus did, and you're silent and not doing anything. What does that reveal about your heart? Mm-hmm. And so I think that in a sense, God is letting this happen to see sort of a mini self-sorting out of the sheep and the goats. Some people's response is, well, I'm just going to, it says in the Bible, there's a verse that talks about silence equals consent. Mm-hmm. And it's come down to us in wedding ceremonies. There's a wedding, and you're in the congregation, and you're silent, you're giving consent. And so if your silence gives consent to weddings, your silence gives consent to other things. And so if there's evil going on, and you're silent, you're giving consent to that. And so I think that in a sense, God is letting, and now some people have been giving consent, and finally they're like saying, wait a second, Disney was talking about coming out with a cartoon where a mother's impregnated by Satan and the child is they call the Antichrist. And it's like, okay, look, I just can't give any more consent. I'm sorry. This is the where I draw the line. And it's going to cut the rubber band, and they're going to snap back and get more excited about Jesus, while other people are going to say, okay, I'll just keep giving consent until they're doing child sacrifice. Who knows, And
but we are doing child sacrifice.
We
call it abortion. We've sanctified the term. And you talked about this phrase, local, local, local. George Soros gets that, does he not?
Yeah.
He understands that principle because that's why he had focused so much money to go into district attorneys' races. And therefore we see laws thrown out the window and not enforced in the law, and people getting out with signature bonds rather than casting bail, or we're emptying the prisons like we see many candidates for office that have been pushing for that, and those in office right now. But getting in charge of those local races, and sometimes we have, sadly, the wrong attitude, Bill. We say, oh, it's just the school board, doesn't really matter. Or it's just this, just the city clerk, it really doesn't matter. But that local race is critically important.
Yeah, and I think that if the churches will take responsibility for the local races, especially the school board, all the higher races will take care of themselves. Right? When people will get a taste for it, and the ones that want to go on and run for higher offices, they'll do it. But if the church just takes responsibility, most school board races are won by less than the number of people that are in the church. You can get just a couple churches in an area that say, hey, let's agree on one mom that's got some backbone and vote for her. You could turn all the school boards overnight. It's a doable thing.
Yeah, let me also ask you this, Bill, because we have seen the rise of the mama bear, so to speak, where concerned moms have said, enough is enough. You've crossed the line. I'm going to go out and speak at the school board and let them know that the course that they've plotted, human growth and development, critical race theory, whatever it may be, they said, we're not going that direction. You're not going to teach my son, my daughter, those very principles. And so they are standing up on that local level. But then we get the big arm of the federal government saying, wait a second, this is extremist. These are, you're demeaning teachers. You are a threat to teachers, and therefore, we're going to put this memo out to the FBI that we're not going to allow this extremist behavior. We have social media then, no, this is disinformation, and we're going to have to pull that off. So, get that off the social media sites. We're not going to allow websites to put this stuff out there. So you've got this big monster out there that is continuing to work against those who are trying to take it back on a local level.
Yeah, it's interesting that they've threatened people showing up at the school boards and speaking. And the answer is, well, why don't you just vote out the people that are on the other side of the table and put in the people? Then you won't have to worry about showing up and getting upset at the school board because you'll be on the school board, right? So it's a doable thing. And I think that the Lord is putting it before us. One of the stories we love best in the Bible is where God's people are in hopeless situations. And he raises up little nobodies, Gideon, Deborah, and they have faith and courage, and God turns things around. And I think...
Even when odds are stacked against them, we see Elijah, the prophets of Baal, and 850 prophets against one on top of Mount Carmel, or the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who will stand up and say, no, we're not going to bow to the image, even though the throngs of people around are bowing down.
And, I've had friends from other countries, and they look to America as the last bastion of freedom. Ronald Reagan said that. There's no place, Reagan gave a speech one time where there were people that had escaped from communist Cuba. And the person that escaped said, I'm better off than you are. And he said, what do you mean? He goes, at least I had some place to escape to. He said, if America goes, where else in the world can you escape to?
Yeah.
There's a quote from Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster. He was the Secretary of State from New Hampshire. And he said, miracles do not cluster. What has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there'll be anarchy throughout the world. And you say, well, why would there be anarchy throughout the world if America's Constitution fails? That's because for 6,000 years of recorded human history, people have suffered under the thumbs of pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and sultans and khans, and they thought, gee, if only we could rule ourselves without a king, wouldn't that be wonderful? And in America, we did it, and if we blow it, there's nothing left for humanity to look forward to this side of heaven than what? Russian dictators, communist Chinese dictators, Iranian ayatollahs. It's going to be a gang war on a global level, and human rights will be crushed. And so we really have to work to save America. But I believe it's doable. I believe that the story I like from the Bible is Manasseh, this wicked, wicked king, sacrificing children to Moloch. And the prophets come to him and says, look, you're doing the same wicked stuff that the people that were here before Israel came in did. And because they were doing it, there's nothing more unjust than killing innocent babies who haven't done anything wrong. I brought Israel in to drive those Canaanites out. And because you're doing it, I'm going to drive you out. So judgment was pronounced. But Manasseh has a grandson named Josiah. And he's like a teenager, and he's the king. And he tells him to clean out the temple that his granddad had trashed. And they come out with the scroll, the law of God. He'd never heard it before. They read it to him. He rips his garments. And he sends to a prophetess in town named Huldah, the wife of the king's tailor, to ask what's going to happen. And she says, tell the man that sent you that judgment's coming, but not during his lifetime, because he repented. And so for the rest of the 31-year reign of Josiah, he has this enormous Passover, sends the Levite priests out to teach the law. And, there's during that revival that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, get saved, just so to speak. And so for the 31-year generation of the reign of Josiah, there's a reprieve from the judgment. I believe if we rend our hearts and we repent, all liberty is individual, all repentance is individual. If we repent, God can put it off.
If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. 2 Chronicles 7:14. Friends, tonight we'd like to open up some phone lines this evening. Maybe something Bill has said this evening has prompted a question in your mind, if you have a brief comment. Our phone number here for inFocus is 414-935-3030. 414-935-3030. Toll free, you may reach us at 1-800-733-8830. That's 1-800-733-8830. If you'd like to text in your question or comment this evening, you can use the text line 414-439-3585. That's again to make sure you put your first name, the city that you're writing from, and just text in your comment 414-439-3585. So the program tonight in Focus. Bill Federer is with us here tonight, and looking forward to your calls. We'd encourage you to call sooner rather than later. Bill, let me already have a text question here from one in Washington County, here just to our north. It says, why would the Founding Fathers have Supreme Court justices be appointed for life instead of having them be elected, even with term limits?
A good question. And they thought that the Supreme Court would never make laws. So back then, only Congress made the laws. Mm-hmm. They didn't think that presidents would someday make executive orders, which were effectively laws. And they didn't think the Supreme Court would make laws. The Supreme Court was the lowest branch. It was in the basement of the Capitol. And it was just supposed to make sure that the laws were carried out the way that the writers of the laws wanted them to be. And it was only, in the 1930s, basically, is when the Supreme Court began to usurp power and began to issue decisions mm-hmm. that would effectively be laws. So at the beginning of the country, they said, they thought if the Supreme Court justices were elected, then they'd be out there campaigning and they could be partisan. So they thought, they would keep them from being partisan.
Mm-hmm. And so it would be wrong to say that when the Supreme Court makes their decision, that's the law of the land. Roe v. Wade is a law of the land. It is not.
Right, and Dred Scott is the perfect example. Mm-hmm. Here's the Supreme Court justice saying that Dred Scott, a black man, was property. And it took decades before they said, look, the Supreme Court was wrong. Mm-hmm. A person of any color is equal. Everybody's equal. And Lincoln said that in his inaugural address.
Let's go to Fred calling from Milwaukee. Hi, Fred, you're on the air.
Yes, I was wanting to know if the battle for our country, America, really isn't a battle for preaching 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, the gospel by which you are saved, to all people here in America and, of course, the world, and then also Israel, because that's where it all begins, is with the gospel.
Well, the gospel is critically important, Fred, and the the free exercise of religion is something that the founders held very firm to. And those who say separation of church and state, we're not going to find that in our Constitution.
Right. So the founders of America fled from Europe. In Europe, you had to believe the way the king tells you to believe. And so the kings of Europe didn't believe in freedom of conscience. And they would burn people at the stake for not believing the way they did. America's founders said, no, your worship of God is only pleasing to God if it's freely given. So they came to America, and it's one of the foundational concepts of America is that the government should not force you to believe or not believe. The government should not force you to have to embrace a LGBT agenda if you don't want to. The government should not force you to embrace transgenderism if you don't want to. The government shouldn't let you get canceled from any social platform because they don't like your views. They wanted to limit the government from taking away your freedoms. So sometimes they say, well, you know, Christian nationalism. No, we want to preserve a nation where you have freedom. Now, nationalism in other countries could be totalitarian, and the irony is that they want to institute a woke nationalism.
Yeah.
They're the ones wanting to institute something where it's totalitarian, you have to believe their way or the highway.
Let's go to Vern next from the south side of Milwaukee. Hi, Vern, you're on the air.
Hi, I have a question about the government and the Constitution. If we have a dictatorship or the government that we're in now, is there anything in the Constitution that says how to redress the government and make changes other than the elections?
Yeah, there is the 2/3 of the states can choose to have a constitutional convention, and then 3/4 of the states ratify it. And so this is a provision that several people are pushing nowadays, you know, Rick Santorum being one to have a constitutional convention to say, look, we don't want power concentrated in the hands of Washington, D.C. Each different system or has its pluses and minuses, you know, so. Some
would refer to as an Article 5 convention?
Yeah, and there's pluses and minuses to it, but the bottom line is people need to be involved. Patrick Henry was against the U.S. Constitution because he said there's no way to remove a president who becomes a dictator. I mean, here he was, a 5-time governor of the state of Virginia, and Patrick Henry was against the Constitution. And so he and George Mason said, no, there has to be a Bill of Rights. We want handcuffs put on this federal government. And so that's when they finally got James Madison to say, okay, if Virginia votes for this Constitution, we promise, in the first session we'll put 10 handcuffs on this federal government. But the idea is that you had anti-federalists that were against the Constitution because it did not put enough limits on the president.
So electing constitutionalists is really important to preserve the Constitution as intended. Thank you, Vern. We've got Lat next in Racine. Hi, Lat, you're on the air.
Yeah, hi, Jim. Hi, Bill. The question I have is, we know that our President of the United States has a term limit. He can only run 2 terms, 8 years. Did our forefathers have term limits years ago on senators and congressmen? And why did they not? Why do we not have term limits on senators and congressmen? And I'll take the question off the air. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lat.
Well, there are none, and they were 2-year terms for Congress and 6-year terms for senators. They viewed running for office like jury duty. Have you ever gotten a jury duty notice? What's your response? Oh, great. I got to take off time from work. I've got to do this. They don't pay you anything. I mean, it's hardly anything. And they viewed, oh, great, I have to go be a state rep. It's like, oh, man, I can't wait till this is over. And so they didn't, George Washington, when they told him that he was going to be the president, he goes, I look forward to this like a prisoner looks forward to the gallows. Like somebody that just, you got a death sentence, you're going to be hung at the gallows. It's like, oh, great, I'm really not looking forward to being president. And so they had that attitude. Now, the U.S. presidents only served 2 terms out of respect for George Washington's example, except Franklin Roosevelt got himself elected 4 times. 12 years he was president. And that's when Congress voted in the 22nd Amendment, limiting a president to 2 terms. And it's easy to remember which amendment because it's 22nd, it's 2-2. So the presidents from the 22nd Amendment on are only limited to 2 terms.
Thank you for the call. Ken is calling from Lake Geneva. Ken, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. Question for you. The interfaith or interreligious dialogue, now they call it, from the Catholic Church is spreading throughout the United States, which is a sin against the Holy Spirit.
Oh, Ken, let's stick with our topic here tonight. We're dealing with our Constitution. We're dealing the battle for our nation right now.
I believe it's destroying the Constitution.
Oh, the interfaith movement is destroying the Constitution.
Joe is financing Rick Warren to push this stuff throughout the United States, so that's against the Constitution.
And who did you say was pushing it?
Sleepy Joe, the president.
Okay. Any comment on this?
Yeah, well, the interfaith movement, I do think, is undermining the gospel. And I think that you have this, they're building some synagogue, mosque, church type thing somewhere.
Abu Dhabi?
Yeah, and but God is a just God, and he has to judge every sin, and he's a loving God in that he provided the Lamb, his own son, to take the judgment for the sin. And so that's why there's only one gospel, and it's approaching God through Jesus Christ, his son. And all the other interfaith movements usually try to get you to not focus on the gospel, and that's why I have a problem with those.
Bill, let me talk about give a couple texts here. This is Jim from Milwaukee. Why aren't more pastors standing up in the pulpits? We should get behind them, but they remain silent. And then they said friendship with the world, not to offend. Why are not more pastors standing up?
It is interesting. A friend of mine had a business leading cruises, and he would have cruises with the World Economic Forum people and the China Silk Road Initiative people, and he was invited to Davos, and there was Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, and they're like saying, okay, we want to push our globalist agenda, and there was a panel full of pastors, or not pastors. One was a pastor that was a well-known name of a more or less woke church. Another was a Catholic cardinal, a Muslim imam, a Baha'i faith, and everything. And this pastor said, well, to do your globalism, you have the money, you have the politicians, you need the third leg of the stool, you need us, the faith people. We represent 5 billion people. And so from that point on, they began to spend millions of dollars to infiltrate seminaries with a woke gospel, with a social justice gospel. Instead of that, the justice is God treats everybody equally. The social justice gospel is we treat some people more equal than others. Ezekiel, it says that the soul that sinneth, it shall die. You don't make some kid pay for some parent or ancestor that did something wrong. And but they specifically wanted to target infiltrating seminaries of all the major denominations and infiltrating not just Christian denominations, but Mormons and Islam and everything. They want to capture and push their globalist agenda through the faith community.
Our telephone number, 414-935-3000, 414-935-3030. 935-3030 is that number. We have Hildy in Milwaukee. You're on the air.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Hello. There is a Chinese police station in New York. How does this affect our Constitution?
Yeah, thank you for that. Good question. We'll have you listen off air. So we've got China that is putting in essence, police stations around the entire world, most recently in New York City. They're not totally police, but we have policing efforts over our own nationals that are in other countries. That's not constitutional for us for this to take place.
That's scary. That's really scary. And I've read stories, even in some of the major newspapers, about how if somebody is a Chinese person over here saying something bad about the government over there, then they'll, first of all, hold their relatives hostage over there, but then they'll come to America and kidnap them and bring them back over there and lock them away for the rest of their life. And that's totally against what America stands for.
Yeah.
And it is terrible that we would allow that to happen on our soil.
Our phone number is 414-935-3030. You have time for a couple more questions. 414-935-3030. 3030. You can text in your question tonight, 414-439-3585. Let me get to another text that came in. This is Kate from Milwaukee. Explain how the current president is using executive orders to bypass our Constitution.
The mandates for wearing masks are one. That there is nothing in the Constitution that gives the president authority to tell you what to wear on your body and to require people to get shots in their body. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives the president the authority to tell anybody to get any shots. With the education and forcing schools to have to push the transgendered agenda and
or be denied lunch money.
Yeah.
But there really is not even a spot for the federal government in education, is there?
Right. You know, in the Bible, God gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. Individuals are commanded to take care of the poor. Family commands are mostly relational: husbands, love your wives. And business commands are do an honest day's work, don't hold back wages. The church is definitely commanded to take care of the poor, and historically they did, starting in hospitals and so forth. There's no command for the government to take care of the poor. The command to the government's the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. There's no command for the government to be involved in health care. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role, and we've let them. So yes, we need to take care of the poor, but it's the church's and the individual's job to do that, not the government. Yes, we need to take care of the immigrant, but it's not the government's job to do that. It's the churches and the individuals.
Here's another question texted in. This is Margaret from Watertown. She said, my question is, how can I or we do our part to save America, or do our part?
Again, local. Get involved in local races, particularly the school board races, and to encourage the pastors to if just a couple churches will pick one person and say, look, we'll vote for this person for school board. In Colorado, they flipped 69 school boards. Miami-Dade, Florida, they flipped it. It's now a majority conservative school board. Jacksonville, Florida, they flipped it. It's now a majority conservative school board. These are doable races, and that's a practical thing that people can do right now.
Is the church to stay out of politics?
You know, New England was started by pastors. You had Pastor Thomas Hooker founded Hartford, Connecticut. Pastor Roger Williams founded Providence, Rhode Island, the First Baptist Church. And they would go to that Hartford, they founded the city, and it was just the pastor and the church. And so the church members went to Reverend Thomas Hooker and say, can you preach a sermon on how we're supposed to set up our government? And he preaches a sermon, the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people. This is unique on planet Earth at a time when you have Muslim sultans, Mongolian khans, Russian czars, Chinese emperors, kings of Spain, France, and all, the whole world's kings. And here you have this little greenhouse taking place in America with pastors and their churches forming communities. And they took their church form of government, everybody's involved. They made it their community government, everybody's involved. And that's why Connecticut's called the Constitution State. It was founded by a pastor and his church. And so you couldn't say, pastor, don't preach on politics, when it's his sermon that's their Constitution. They couldn't say, well, church members don't get involved in politics, when all there was in Hartford was the church members. There wasn't any non-believers there to be lazy and let them take over. And so when the revolution starts, and they had one building, it's called the meeting house. That's where the pastor would teach the Bible, and that's where they would do their city business. The word synagogue means meeting house. That's where the rabbi would teach the law. That's where they would gather to do their city business. Why build a separate building just to talk about a different topic? And so the idea is that America was a church plant. We took this congregational model of church government and we made it their colonial government in New England, and eventually the U.S. Constitution, we the people. And so it wasn't until the 1700s, when you had the German pietist pastors come to America, that they thought, well, if you being Christians more than just following doctrine, you have to have an experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life will change, and you won't do worldly things you used to do, like go to bars and brothels and lewd theater and get involved in government. Wait, what was that last thing? Yeah, government's filled full of worldly people, and if you're really a Christian, you're not going to do worldly things, and you're not going to get involved in the government. So this is the early 1700s, and this is the beginning of the thought that it's holier not to be involved.
Wow.
I mean, what a strange thought But it's, oh, we got to stay from the worldly bars and worldly theaters and brothels, and I can't get involved in worldly government because I'm holy now. I'm withdrawing from the world. And there's actually a middle of the road. Yes, it's a personal experience with Jesus, but yes, the scripture says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. You want to be involved so you can leave them a country where they have the freedom for boys to be boys and girls to be girls, the freedom where you can preach the gospel, right? And so it's the big point I bring out is that silence equals consent. And so if you're being really holy and not getting involved, you're being silent concerning the sins, the abortions and the transgendered boys and girls bathrooms. And if you're silent when there's sin, you are giving consent to the sin. Like your silent gives consent in a wedding ceremony, your silence gives consent to what's going on in the community. And if you give consent to sin, you're partaking of the guilt of the sin, you'll be judged as if you committed the sin. And so all these people that think they're being real spiritual by not getting involved are actually by their silence inviting the judgment of God upon their heads.
Friends, you're watching inFocus. William J. Federer is our guest here this evening. He has written some powerful books dealing with issues that we've talked about here this evening. I'm thinking particularly of Socialism, the Real History from Plato to Present, and again, the subtitle, How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control, and then also, Who is the King in America and Who are the Counselors to the King? Both of these books available at our VCY bookstore at 107th and Capitol Drive. Would like to also mention, Bill is speaking to pastors coming up next week at our Pastors Appreciation Luncheon, Wednesday, October 19th, 10 o'clock in the morning at the VCY headquarters. Pastors do need to reserve their spot. It's free for pastors by calling 414-935-3000 by this Friday the 14th. That's 414-935-3000 for pastors to attend. And then also just keep in mind, Bill has many resources and lots of information at AmericanMinute.com, AmericanMinute.com. And you'll find really a commentary for every day. You'll find lots of tidbits from American history. You'll find a number of resources and presentations that he has made there as well. But Bill, as the prophet Hosea said, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And we do need to become knowledgeable of our history. One of the things we learn from history is that we don't learn from history, it seems, but how critical it is for such a time as this.
Well, I believe that, again, God seems to wait until things look hopeless, and then he raises up little nobodies with faith and courage to turn things around.
Great.
And whether it's a Gideon, a David, a Moses, or you that's watching, this is your chance to, the word paraclete means helper. So you do something and the Holy Spirit comes along and helps you.
Amen.
So,
Bill, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Jim.
Bill will also be with us on upcoming crosstalk programs. We hope you'll be listening to WVCY Radio 107.7 FM. Our time is gone. Thanks for joining us here on TV's 30s in Focus. Good night.